Welcome to SWISSUES. I'm here with Armin Scharlach, Thierry Fausten, and Nadia Stoykov. And in this episode, we're going to talk about risk. So, Nadia, can you launch us into the subject of risk?
Well, the subject of risk is all around us, but the most important thing, of course, is defining what do we understand and how do we see risk. It's very important to know what exactly we're talking about, to know what we would like to control or what we can control and what is out of our control and how should we handle. Armin?
Let me try a provocative definition. Risk means life. My grandma used to say life is what happens when you have planned something entirely different. And I think she was pretty right with that. Now, there are obviously some more business-oriented frameworks that say the same thing with more words. And I think one of the ones that many are aware of is the VUCA framework, initially from the military sector and then widely adopted in the automotive industry, defining risk as the combination of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Thierry, I see that you're smiling.
Yes, I'm smiling because I find VUCA to be very passé and cliched. Because essentially, as you were saying, life has always been VUCA something. Cavemen didn't know any better what would happen in the next minute. I think what we see today is people expect to have foresight, more than forecast, but foresight, ultimate knowledge on everything that happens. And if you take risk as the probability that something happens, is it positive or negative, you end up having a very different approach to all of that. And especially when you work on supply chain risk management, and what's related to making sure your operations get going, you really have a different mindset working on that. What do you think, Armin?
Fair point. You mentioned supply chain. I think this is where probably most people are talking about risk most frequently. We all know the examples from the Suez Channel and where the supply chain were interrupted by things no one had foreseen, and all of a sudden everyone had to cope with the consequences. In my perspective, it doesn't matter that much where the risk is, whether it is on the supply chain side, whether it's on the customer side, whether it's on the regulator side, but it's about how is an organization able to cope with it. And there the quite often overstressed term resilience comes into play. Now resilience again comes in many different flavors, things you can do. And here I would actually try the provocative thought that you can't protect yourself against any risk because it simply would get way too expensive. Risk inherently implies the idea that it only comes at a certain probability that something happens. And therefore, if you're trying to make your entire life as an organization completely bulletproof, why I think it's impossible anyway, it definitely would bring you out of any competitiveness because it would be way too expensive.
I'm glad that Nadia raised this early on because I was hoping we would get into the philosophy of what risk is and probability. I wasn't expecting it to be the opening statement or the opening question. But now that it is, I'm going to volunteer that I think people, generally human beings, are very bad at risk and probability. And I think business people are particularly bad because they like solidity, they like predictability, and they find it very difficult to deal with uncertainty. And people in general, they either want something to happen or they think it won't happen. Now, a good example is climate change. That polarizes people into those who think the world won't last another 2 generations and those who deny it, absolutely. Nobody seems, or very few people in the middle, seem able to accept that there is a probability of something extremely serious is going to happen, and that even if the odds are only 100 to 1 against, it is worth taking precautions. So instead of adopting that sensible point of view, they polarize into those who deny it and those who say the world won't last 2 more generations. That's my instant philosophical response to it. Thierry?
I would say I could agree with you in the sense that human beings hate this uncertainty, so the risk part. And I would say even more, they hate getting ready for things that can happen. And it's very unfortunate because, as I was saying, it's adverse events. Everybody think about that. And it's also a very positive event. You have both type of possibilities opening in front of you. So I understand that certainty can be very comforting. However, uncertainty, it's also what creates opportunities. And if you don't have opportunities, you can never make a difference. You know, I would say worst scenario, apart from don't look up, is just think that things are going to just perpetuate forever, and then there will be no change, so there will be no evolution, and so nothing is ever going to happen. But I see that Nadia wants to react to that.
Absolutely. Actually, you could not eliminate risk. And I don't even think that we should discuss that. There's always going to be something uncertain that we never thought about. And doesn't matter what the probability is, it happens. So it's more important to know how you handle risk. And I think as well it's a question of culture, because in certain cultures where you have harder life and more risks are coming at you, you're more apt to adapting to risk or to different circumstances faster. In my opinion, this is the very key to business, to handling business risk. And human ability to cope with risk depends on circumstances. So imagine you live in a very tough environment where you have to react to all kinds of risks. Your tolerance level to risk becomes much higher. And then you can take events that in other countries are considered as a huge risk as something daily and very normal. So I think it's something that you can train how to manage risk, how to handle risk, and have a process of quickly reacting to it.
Yeah, can I come in on that, Nadia? Because
sure.
You mentioned resilience, and I think you also said you can't avoid risk. In my wilderness years in procurement, when I first started looking at supply chains, and we had to go to several different sources for products, or different products. We had a philosophy of having only one supplier for each product. And the reason for it was that we reckoned there was only one best supplier. So why shouldn't we rely on the best in each case? When we thought about going to 2 or 3 suppliers for one of these, it became very obvious very quickly that we were going to have to pay more and do more work ourselves and become accountable for the continuity of supply. And relying on one supplier and making sure that that supplier was copper-bottomed, lead-lined, all the other expressions you can use to describe robust, just made absolute sense and was accepted by everyone in the organization. I'm suggesting that at least in the short term, the robust approach, doing everything you can to make sure it won't happen, is a viable strategy. But Armin wants to say something, and I'm hoping you won't disagree too violently with me, Armin.
No, I do agree. And being part of an economical advisory, I think of both what you were saying is actually lighting things on both angles. There is certain things that companies or that as individuals you can do in order to protect yourself from certain risk factors. I call that typically resistance, and things like dual sourcing can protect you from certain risks. They rarely are cheaper. Logic, I think I would even think that except there would be capacity limits, having a dual source almost always is at best at the same cost, but typically more expensive, and therefore you need to judge, is it worth that extra money, that extra hassle that you mentioned? But there are also a lot of risks where you cannot necessarily protect yourself up front, and that is leading back to what Nadia was saying earlier. There will still things happening that no one had on the plan, on the agenda before, and for that something is needed, which I would typically call both a reconnaissance ability, so that you are recognizing that something is happening that you had not factored in before, and a react competence in the organization, that you can react to that circumstance at least faster than your competitors in order to have an advantage there. And it's a combination of both, and you need to balance these factors out. You cannot spend all your money just on becoming more resistant. Dual sourcing is never a good idea if you apply it everywhere without further logic. Just hoping that you are, with your agile approach, solving anything that's happening might also be not the best idea. It's the balance that is needed between these 3 different resilience levers.
Interesting that you talk about reconnaissance was the word you used, It's a thing of mine that companies are very bad at reconnaissance. They're very bad at looking outside their own organization. And I'm talking about big companies. And of course, the bigger something is, the lower is its surface area in relation to the volume of activity inside. Companies tend to look inwards and become very unaware of what competitors, suppliers, customers, the public, politicians are doing outside their own organization.
But even if a risk is extremely visible, and let's take the current example with the tariffs without going into details, everyone is obviously highly aware of the situation. The third element, what I call the react, how flexible, how quickly are you able to react to changed circumstances? You see a huge variety in the organizations. In many organizations, we see at the moment lots of discussions. So what is it what we are going to do about it? While a few ones are more agile than others and are already reacting on it. My most beloved example comes from the COVID area, where a CPO of a large Swiss pharma company did a super smart move when she actually purchased on the cost center account of procurement containers and containers with equipment for protecting people without asking the organization and the business stakeholders first, do you need it? How much do you need it? What are their preferences? But she was brave enough to make that decision herself, purchases on the account of the procurement, and then had it in place where everyone else was still debating.
Well, this is the speed of reaction that you give as an example here, which of course is important, especially in such an emergency as COVID, because nobody knew about COVID before, nor ever we thought about such an epidemic. But again, I mean, how do you define the risk? And what is really the risk? Is the risk the fact that people will not have protective equipment? Or is the risk the fact that you're not going to have raw materials to continue production? By the way, Bill, I fully agree with you with one source supplier. That has been my philosophy all along. But in order to have a plan B, I always wanted to have consignment stocks. So if something happens, I have enough time to go to plan B, which is the next best supplier, but don't really use them when it's not needed. And monitor very closely the relationship with supplier number one. And it's something that, by the way, many people have argued with me that it's not the right approach, but the quantity of savings and economic benefit that you get from it are absolutely superior to the next best approach.
Yeah, I want to react on that. I think from my experience, it directly depends on not the risk you would take in your acceptance of risk. It is about the consequences you could generate. You know, when I was in the automotive, at a point in time, I was buying components that would end up in more than 10% of the automotives made in Europe. For that, okay, apart from the pure geographical footprint with factories from Turkey to Poland to Portugal and so many countries in between. Just the sheer risk of having to stop manufacturing lines, you can't do that. So you need to have multiple sources that are cross-redundant one to the other. Otherwise, if you really have something bad happening, then your impact on the whole sector and on your company is just too big. One thing I want to go back to is the perception of what you're doing and how much possibilities for you want to build in to continue operating, I would say whatever happens, even though we all know that the whatever happens will never work. The big thing I believe with the situation of having adverse events is people are afraid of pushing the red button and triggering action. This example of that CPO who bought PPE on her own account. Yes, it's brave and it's the right thing to do. So many people don't want to disturb, don't want to steer things around. And when we have now, supply chain event management systems, they are going to trigger immediate actions like you have in safety equipment in trains or planes or anything, because you need to be able to act and react when a number of certain circumstances are met. Sometimes you want to have a human factor to say, yes, I want to, or no, I don't want to. However, there is shyness and people don't want to be the one saying, hey, there is a big trouble, we need to do what we planned. Armin, you have a raised hand. You want to contribute there?
Let me combine your thought with the thought from Nadia earlier about what is risk. I would actually think that despite all the discussions about purpose that most organizations are having in their vision and mission statements, in the end, businesses are all about to please the investors. And from having worked with many CFOs in my life, what I have seen is that while they certainly like years where they exceed the forecasts, what they really hate, which is the worst thing that can happen to them because it has a direct implication on how the investors are seeing the organization progressing, is when they have to correct their profit forecast. And this is in the end why I answer to you, Nadia, what is risk about? I think anything that happens that impacts the forecasted profit for the year or the month or further foreseeable future is a risk that organizations are trying hard to avoid.
I think you're right to look at it at a business level. And I think one of the mistakes that a lot of people make is to look at it on a functional level. Let me give a quick plug. In the last quarter, I think there'll be a meeting in Zug between SIPS and the canton of Zug. And they'll be looking at risk. And when they started planning it, they came up with 10 different areas. My rule is never to have more than 5 things in a list, but this has got 10, so I'm warning you now. Supply and demand, operation and production, logistics and transport, geopolitical and nationalism, natural disaster and climate, financial and economic, cybersecurity and IT, regulatory compliance and ethical, supply chain complexity and transparency, technology, AI, and digital disruption. Now, some of those overlap a little bit, but
actually they're 10, but they're 20 because one is 2. Every one of them is 2 topics.
Yeah.
So practically that's life.
Yeah,
that's what we can say. It's like absolutely everything.
Yeah, but I think it explains why it's so important to do it at a business level rather than on a functional reductionist level and take any one of those areas at a time. But one of the standard techniques for doing that is in business interruption risk planning, where you have the classic matrix, where you have the probability of it happening on one axis and the impact on the other axis. And when the probability of it happening and the impact are high, it's a sort of call to action because they're in the box in the top right-hand side, which is flashing red. And so you have to do something. But there's another factor that comes in, and this is often used in engineering, and that is the forecastability, or how much warning do you get that something's going to happen. If you're driving an old car, you know pretty well when one of the axle bearings is about to go, because for a few 100 miles, the thing's clattering away. So the wheel isn't suddenly going to fall off. And so those 3 factors are the classic way of doing it. And they make sense if you're doing it on a business basis, because you can look at everything. You can look at the chances of the plant catching fire. You can look at the chances of you losing all your registration data and having to withdraw the product from the market. You can look at the chances of some key staff leaving. You can do everything because it's on a business basis. But there's one more I'm going to mention. I'm going to call it proximity, because it's really, really hard to get executives excited about something that is outside their term of office or the options on their shares. So it is how familiar are the decision makers with the issue and how is it likely to impact them? And you may scoff at that, but actually that is one of the main things that decides whether or not risk factors are considered and whether anyone is going to invest in mitigation factors. So that is, when you come down to it, those are the operational things. That's how a risk program gets started. Sorry for going on so much.
Very interesting. And as you know, in game theory, I often say that organizations are supposed to act rationally, but in the end, there are humans involved. But what you were saying was actually raising a thought in the back of my mind, that here we have a very interesting discrepancy between how organizations behave and how humans behave, at least in their private life. In the private life, and I'm coming back to what you were saying earlier, Thierry, people are trying to avoid risk, which is why some of the industries like the automotive industry make very good money from selling us bigger and bigger cars with more and more security features in there that hopefully most of us will never need. We are paying a lot of premium for something that we probably will never need in our life, but just in case, it would be good that we have all these assistance and security measures in there. On the other hand, that was my thought when you were talking, Bill, is an organizational level, probably because the absolute cost of protection can easily become quite a significant number. Organizations tend to underestimate the risk and do too little too late.
And then we come to the life cycle question that we discussed last time. It depends how mature is the organization, how it's going to react to risk. Okay, if it's a startup, what would they consider risk? And if it's a very mature organization, what they would consider risk and how they would react to it. So for me, the way to handle risk is to create a robust way in the organization for quickly responding to the changing circumstances. And knowing at that point in time who exactly is in charge and what to do in order to be reactive immediately and hopefully before the company.
Interesting that you raised that, Nadia, because I think it was, Armin earlier talked about reconnaissance, and I responded saying how bad companies are at it. They refuse to invest in it. And I believe that a lot of reconnaissance used to be done by middle management, and the middle office of the organization that's been stripped out. Armin mentioned reconnaissance. I've just been thinking back. In the viable systems model developed by Stafford Beer, he identifies, I think it's 6 different systems within an organization that have to be there for the organization to function. I've already given you a list of 10. I'm not going to go into a list of 6. You have to look up VSM yourself. But I will tell you that system 4 is this reconnaissance thing. Who has the responsibility to look outside the organization, up and down the supply chain, sideways to the horizon, to look at new technologies, upcoming risks, and to interpret these for the organization, and also to look around the organization itself for things that people might not have suspected. And I've often thought that in large organizations, this is completely missing. It's the sort of thing people might do in their spare time or in a bit of distracted moment. In a small organization or a startup, it's automatic. You're looking outside all the time and reacting quickly to it. In a large organization, it atrophies and dies if it's not actively removed in the name of Lean Six Sigma and efficiency. Thierry, you wanted to knock me down on that one.
No, that's okay. I tend to agree with you. And to me, the responsibility of looking outside is everybody's. And what I want to say by that, so a lot of theories say that procurement and supply chain are the boundary spanners because they really interact with the outside. Marketing is supposed to be identifying customer needs and demands. And so they should be aware of what's coming outside. Sales are the same. Engineering is supposed to be looking for the best technologies or the technologies that meet the needs and requirements. Finance is supposed to be interacting with investors, as Armin was saying, but also on the financial world to grab money. So they need to know what's happening around. If you have more examples of companies that are really completely closed with no one having discussion outside, it's very, very surprising. On top of that, we have so many social networks that connect us on a professional side, and I'm really talking on the professional side, that, people are discussing what's up as we are doing now. So if a company is completely isolated from the outside world, it is, I believe, doing something extremely wrong and extremely dangerous.
Bill, I know that you are criticizing the efficiency and endeavors that have cut out middle management in many organizations. I actually would believe it's not so much whether there is a middle management in place or not, but I would postulate that it is a wrong incentivization of people in organizations that is limiting them to spend any time on this reconnaissance upfront. because it's not paying out for them. If you're spending time and energy to warn about certain things that might happen, everyone will be annoyed and it will just cost money. And why are we really doing this? Is this really important? Everyone will blame you if then this risk has not materialized, because they will blame you for having wasted money. And if the risk does materialize, everyone else saying, hey, we could not have known it any better, so let's deal with it.
Well, that's to my point earlier about everybody wants visibility, and then they polarize. It will happen or it won't happen. But I think the point about System 4 in the viable systems model is that it's not just looking for risks, it's looking for opportunities as well. So, and I think the situation is much, much, much worse than Thierry's experiences, which have obviously been with very outward-looking companies. I think you'll find that the average engineer in a company is very steeped in the engineering technologies of that company and knows pathetically little about the technologies used in competitive industries, competitive companies, and other industries. Maybe
perfect. That's what consultants are for.
Somebody has to engage and control the consultant, give them their brief. You can't rely entirely on the consultant to be there all the time telling you what's happening in the big wide world.
Absolutely, and that's where the learning comes. It's very important to develop your people and provide them training opportunities as well as interactions with suppliers or competitors in order for them to see how things are done in other companies. So they can make their judgment, but as well keep them on the forefront of what is new in their line of business or technology, if it's an engineer or development of machines and all of that. And very often, in my experience, supplier of equipment, for example, organize trainings about the different types of technologies. And they invite us to bring people from the company and learn about what's new. And it's a selling method, but at the same time, it's very educational because you don't have to buy anything. But it's very educational, especially for the middle management engineer, which has been working in one company all of their lives. That's why learning comes here, to keep your radar screen very open in order for you to consider many different options. But it depends as well on which company you're working for, the life cycle. If it's a very conservative old company that has old equipment, old assets, and that's the technology they have, period, what's the incentive? Because if this guy learns something new and very exciting, they will leave and say, no, I don't want to work with this old crap anymore. I want the new technology. I want to work with the new technology. And let's talk about another risk. And this is the risk of the people that you hire or the people that you don't hire. Let's put it this way, because in my opinion, for a company to stay alive, you always have to have challengers in the company. And these challengers have to be people, they normally come from the outside, they haven't been their whole lives in the company. They're brave enough to speak and give suggestions about things that could be improved. But somebody needs to listen to them and do something about it. I think this is the most healthy way in which people should be brought in the company in order to refresh the bloodstream. Because sometimes it becomes too stale and you believe that you're the best and that's the only way things could be done. And you don't see obvious solutions for very small issues, which for you are like huge problems.
I think you're right, Nadia, to raise this question of the people, the staff, the employees. I don't agree it's up to others to listen to them. I think it's up to them to make themselves heard. But I do strongly agree that a lot of companies end up with a careless culture, a culture in which they're not really interested in challenging themselves, not really interested in questioning what would happen if. Couldn't we do that? But I don't know how you overcome that. Maybe you've got some thoughts, but I'm going to call it the careless culture. And that borrows a little bit from a recent book about Facebook called Careless People, the story of the firm where I used to work, which I would recommend to anybody to read. Careless People. It's about the most senior people in Facebook. Yeah, the people thing is really important.
It is. And actually, I think it's very important to put on top, because they create a culture in the whole company. And if you have careless people on top, I haven't read the book, I'm not referring to anything, then the whole culture trickles down. And then people just go and do their jobs to a satisfactory level, but nobody's traveling the extra mile and they don't care because they don't see it coming from the top. They don't see it as a value in the company. And that's very important for changing the culture. That's why it's so difficult to change the culture, but it comes with example. Yes, Thierry?
Just was always thinking, when we talk about risk to the movie Don't Look Up, a number of people try to get their voices heard, and the top management, if we can call it this way, is just like, trying to silence them, hoping that on a personal level, these top management people have their own escape plan, not knowing what's going to happen with it, and just living, if it goes bad for others. Like some people saying, yeah, it's going to be bad, but it will be okay. It's going to be bad for others, it's going to be okay for them because they have this insulation from the consequences of risks materializing. As much as I fully agree that people have to be proactive and avoid complacency, sometimes complacency is the norm because making noise, raising flags and trying to get things moving is dangerous behaviors in organizations. I don't know what others have as an experience to that, but I've seen it, like if you have, speak-up lines that are not anonymous, no one is going to use them as an example, and risks of misbehaviors are then materializing significantly.
I think one of the things I've noticed in the past is that compliance and carelessness are not opposites. They coexist. And actually, the more compliance you have, the more compliance rules you have in an organization, which are supposedly there to avoid risk, the more difficult it is to work through the processes in that organization, the more workarounds and informality are developed, and the greater are the number of risks. They multiply. So I thought I'd throw that little bit of philosophy in. And I have seen it in pharmaceutical companies where when you lift the lid and look inside, you think, how can this be happening? But it is. And then you begin to realize, actually, the organization wouldn't work if it wasn't for the informality.
I think there's a method or an entire set of methods that combines these thoughts. Over-regulating things and making them overly bureaucratic is probably not a good idea. But we also have to accept that while we think that most people would sign up to this common saying that first-class managers hire first-class managers and only second-class managers hire third-class managers, in reality, people are very often incentivized by the way how their organization is set up, not to hire the best people into their team because they would potentially put themselves at risk and in danger. And the same applies to what you were saying earlier, Thierry, when people are not incentivized to act for the better of the organization, but more for their own incentivification, then you have these effects happening, whether it's in the movies or in businesses.
Absolutely. And it's totally human nature to hire people that are not a threat to you. And this is the dangerous point. This really is the dangerous point because that's how you create complacency. You hire only yes men, and these yes men are doing nothing else but confirming your state of thinking, which probably is not relevant for years. But unfortunately, that's part of the plague in the big organizations. In entrepreneurial culture, probably it's not the same. I would argue that it's actually much, much better.
What we seem to be saying, with various levels of agreement, is that if you want to identify or assess the level of risk in an organization or the probability that something will go wrong, you should be looking at the people it employs and whether or not they are yes men, to use or yes women or whatever. How compliance focused they are. And of course, I try not to use Trump's name when I can avoid it because it triggers me a little bit. But there you do have an example of an organization in which there is too high a number of people who have been turned to the dark side, simply seem to go along with whatever it is for the sake of their own seat in the Senate or place in the government or whatever. Change the subject.
And as a matter of fact, the funny thing about that is all of them are rich and, very people with means that don't really need any material goods, but they still continue to do it. And this is what I don't understand, that means that a set of people with different values. And these values are different from the values of the majority of the rest.
Thierry, you raise your hand there.
Yeah, I want to thank Nadia for that example, because this is typically an example of people who are not going to live by the consequences of what they do. I was wondering the other day, what is the opinion of the, I think he's now 20 years old, son of that person you were talking about? Because possibly the world that is going to be left after is going to be very difficult to live in. Even when you have a lot of money, if you don't have water, if you have very difficult healthcare situations, if you can't breathe the air, money won't save you. So I think that, coming back to what I was saying about facing the consequences and trying to, or believing you're shielded from them, drives very different behaviors. The people who think they are, invincible when skiing or driving cars or whatever, they take risks for themselves, they generate risks for themselves and for others. When something wrong happens, they are like, oh, yeah, I didn't believe it could happen. Yeah, it could happen, The thing is, even if it does something bad to them, and I don't wish bad to anyone, I wish you know that, I'm sure you know that. What happens when they hit someone else and this someone else doesn't have the healthcare or whatever work protection that allows them to go further in life? You can ask courts to, remedy. No amount of money is going to remedy if you are in a wheelchair or if you have, terrible circumstances for yourself. It's not money that's going to change that. And so I think that coming back to what happens in companies, people making decisions that are sometimes too brazen, given the facts that they have, they disregard the facts and then continue on one direction rather than the other. And this direction ends up into what was predictably a bad situation. People who are going to lose their jobs or customers that are going to be affected are rarely the person who pushed for that decision. It's extremely rare.
Of course.
And in many cases, these people who disregarded clear signals that it would be a bad outcome, they have a bailout plan one way or the other.
And here is exactly the contrast between the culture of values and the culture of interest. So certain people have culture of interest, so they don't care what happens with the others. As long as my interest is protected, okay. And this is the current administration we're talking about. And the others is the values. The values means that if you have certain principles in life, you have to stick to them no matter what. Here comes the big clash of today's time, that certain countries are purely interest-driven and driven by entitlement, which is yet another plague, and others still try to hang on values.
We started by asking about the meaning of risk, what is it? And we went through some operational stuff, which is the way most companies actually look at risk, and we questioned that. And then we started talking about politicals and the US president, whose name we won't mention. But I wanted to say that actually we should think more about the situation in America, because it is very, very common in companies to get an autocratic ruler. And I've seen it in a company in Basel where it just corrupted the whole organization. Tried to change it on a whim. It became very clear that anybody who tried to point out to them the foolishness of changing the organization in a way that just wasn't sensible, that it was likely to end badly. But nobody on the board dared contradict him or speak up. The company had been growing rapidly. It shrank to about 60% of its former level. And then it was sold to the Chinese, which is probably giving you too much information.
Yeah, we know who you're talking about.
But that was basically an autocratic, narcissistic CEO.
It's a very rational behavior of people to just say what the ruler is saying and to follow it. For them personally, individually, it might make sense to act that way, while it is not the best for the society or the organization.
We've covered a lot of ground. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. Maybe some listeners might feel that we've strayed into philosophy rather a lot, but I actually think it's really important. And I think a lot of companies could be learning a lot about the ethics, the morality, the philosophy, the culture that creates the operational problems that surface when we start to talk about risk. Has anybody got any final points they'd like to put before I wind up this episode on risk? Armin.
I think in your private life, everyone typically compares offers from insurances when you want to protect yourself against risk. And you make a decision not only whether you're going with insurance A or B, but whether you take a certain insurance at all, because you try to evaluate, is that really money I should spend? What I'm seeing often lacking in business organizations is the same economical perspective into the things that an organization should do in order to make them less vulnerable from risk. And you remember the framework that I was saying with all these R's. So resilience is the combination of resistance, trying to cope with things that are foreseeable risks. Reconnaissance, how can I learn about non-foreseeable things that happen? React, how can I make myself agile enough then to respond to what is happening? And ideally not just doing it for yourself, but for the people who are collaborating with your suppliers, your customers, which would be then the reach as the final perspective. And doing this not just as a long list of the million things that one could do, but putting a fairly precise calculation behind it, which is an economic modeling to find out what are the things that you should do, what are the things you better not do.
I think that the philosophical approach is totally appropriate in this case, because apart from what we're thinking within one company, we live in a bigger world. You can see the geopolitical risks all around us. There are many unpredictable things, like, let's say, the earthquake in Myanmar or something like that, natural disaster happening. The key to it is be prepared for everything. Don't take yourself for granted. Really stay vigilant and try to have common sense and practicality in all of it. And live by values. That's the other thing I want to say.
That's fairly philosophical, Nadia, and that's what I like to hear. I love rising above the operational methodologies. So thank you, Armin Scharlach, Thierry Fausten, Nadia Stoykov, who joined me today, Bill Young, in this episode of SWISSUES to talk about risk. Until the next episode, we'll sign off and say goodbye.